on the Dialogue Institute YouTube channel, and we're beginning a new series on Peacebuilders. Of course, in everybody's mind, Mahatma Gandhi is the first person who comes to mind when we talk about peace and Peacebuilders. So we're fortunate today to have with us his great-grandson, Tushar Gandhi. And
thank you very much. Good morning to everybody.
Welcome. So would you like to get us started with just a little bit about the philosophy of nonviolent peace building that came out of the movement in India?
Well, to begin with, as Gandhi, or Bapu as I call him, said that his ideology was not an invention of his own. It was based on the building blocks on which civilization itself was built, which was truth, peace, unity, love, and equality. Those were the criteria on which he evolved his entire ideology of nonviolent peace building. And he did not, the uniqueness of him was that he did not compartmentalize truth and love and peace and unity into separate boxes. He created a whole mix of it till it evolved as a kind of a lifestyle itself. And so for him, his own method of living was becoming his philosophy. And so that was also apparent in his public stance and the public movements that he began or he led. It was a continuation of the life that he was leading. There was no personal and no public. There was no difference between those two personalities. And I think that is what has sustained that ideology and that method of peaceful non-compliance, if one could coin those two words together. His whole fight for rights was based on non-violent, peaceful non-compliance. He would not comply with the tormentor, but he would not hit back at his tormentor either. And I think that was the entire uniqueness of his method that he put into practice, which was showcased initially in South Africa when he fought for equal rights for his people in South Africa as loyal citizens of the empire. And then back in India when he fought for the right to liberty of his people and overthrew the same empire with whom he had fought as a loyal subject. Now he fought for his right to liberty also. And so I think it was a continuing journey from South Africa, which began in South Africa, was tested. The entire strategy was tested out in South Africa, and then its more fine-tuned, refined version was implemented in India. And it continues to do that. One of his most evergreen and ever relevant messages was before the Salt March, when he was asked if he had a message to give humanity, what message would he give to the world? And on the eve of the day that he was going to break the salt law, he gave his message to a journalist from Canada, which said, I want world sympathy in this battle of right against might. World sympathy in this battle of right against might. It was an appeal very difficult for anybody to deny. And even today, the battle of right against might continues. And if you look at it, apart from a few aberrations, you will always realize that humanity has always stood with right and not as permanently with might. Yes, for some time you see that might conquers everything, but then people realize what is right, and then that mighty person finds themselves isolated, and that isolation itself weakens them. So I think that was the charm of Gandhi and his methods that he used. Very cunningly, very shrewdly, he used those methods. But
I especially like your emphasis on the integrated life, that there has to be action and life commensurate with your ideals. And that has consequences. And I think another thing that Gandhi showed us was that he was willing to take the consequences.
yes, he was always willing to face the consequences of his actions. And for everything, every time that he thought that he was going wrong, his method was going wrong, he looked inward. He looked for a weakness or a flaw within himself. And he blamed the failure or the mistake that was happening on a weakness within his own psyche, his own personality, his own way of life. And so all the errors and mistakes were internalized while the success was shared with everybody else. And I think that is what was the uniqueness of his leadership, that he was willing to accept all the blames. And for every time, if you look at it in his lifetime, every time if he found lapse in morality or lapse in ethicality, he blamed himself and he atoned for those things by attempting to purify himself of those weaknesses and frailties. And that was what gave him strength, and that was what also, in a very proactive manner, taught a lesson to the people he was leading, who in their hearts of hearts realized what was happening and realized who was really to blame for those errors that had happened. But it
It's
was
so
so much better that they were never reprimanded and said, "You are wrong." Gandhi always said, "I think something is wrong with me, within me. This is my weakness manifesting in the public."
it's so easy to blame other people when things are troubling, when we don't understand problems in the world. It's easy to identify blame in other people. It's much harder to be honest with yourself and see that what it is you dislike about others probably mirrors something that you dislike in yourself.
Yes, I think what Gandhi achieved in his lifetime, what Bapu achieved in his lifetime was the ability to look in the mirror of his soul. He kept talking about the small, faint voice of his soul that he used to listen to when he was troubled. And he always reaffirmed the fact that everyone has that voice of their soul within them. It's only those who, tune themselves to hear that voice are then able to follow their soul. And Gandhi was able to do that. Bapu, throughout his lifetime, claimed that his soul spoke to him, guided him, nurtured him, and mentored his actions. And I think that was what it was. And I think that voice was the mirror of his soul, which was showing him the grim picture. We look at a mirror and we all say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the prettiest of them all?" We want to see the prettiest image. But the reality is that only people who can be brave enough to see the warts in that image are the ones who have the capacity to change for the better. And that is what Bapu did.
We all seem to want grace, mercy, and peace for ourselves, but we're often unwilling to extend that same grace, mercy, and peace to other people.
Yes, and that is where everything else is overshadowed by our selfish greed. We make ourselves so important to everything else that everything else becomes subservient to us. Even our hatred, when we face hatred, we respond to that hatred with hate ourselves without realizing that that is only multiplying hate. And if we want to get rid of hate, then we must respond with kindness, with love, with understanding to make the other person feel ashamed of his or her own hate. But generally speaking, all of us, we will respond with equal or even stronger hatred when we are confronted by it. And so that is what the difference that sets us apart. Otherwise, Bapu was just an ordinary human being. He wasn't he wasn't a divine soul. He was not a god. He was not godlike at all. But the fact was that he placed himself. He responded to hate without hate. And then I don't mean that we should not have anger, but we should have the ability to use that anger as an energy to change the situation
I
rather than
wish
a
you would
weapon to compound the situation.
I wish you would say something about his influence on the civil rights movement, because many of the people who participated in that adopted the path of nonviolence, and
Well,
they were willing to take the consequences, which were beatings and being publicly humiliated. It was when America saw that on TV that they became distressed
the,
about things.
the interesting story about the civil rights movement in the US is that much before the agitations started, the confrontations happened, the pioneering leaders of the civil rights movement, they were inspired by Gandhi's ideology and his methods. And many of those leaders from the beginning of the civil rights, even the thought of the civil rights equality movement, corresponded with Gandhi and learned from him. And then some of them even came to India in his ashrams to go through the nonviolent passive resistance boot camp as such and underwent training for 6 months to a year in those ashrams, not always with Gandhi, but with his most contemporaries. And they went back to the US and they trained a core group of the, if you can say, the frontline responders of the civil rights movement. In meetings and things, they were subjected to humiliation, they were subjected to ridicule, they were subjected to downright uncouth behavior, insults, and even beatings. The story was narrated to me that in that training, they were, the people who were being trained would be spat on also. And they were then tested whether they lashed out in anger or they were able to control their emotions. And only when they passed that stage where that instinct of lashing out was subdued were they allowed to go and confront the racism in practice. And that was the influence that Gandhi had. Much before Dr. King began speaking of Gandhi and the inspiration that he got from Gandhi, this was how the whole cadre of the passive resistors in the civil rights movement were trained. It was like a military training, but there were no arms. The arms and ammunition in that was of their own belief, their own ethicality, their own ideology. And that is what made it inexhaustible. In a gun, you can only shoot as many bullets as are loaded in the gun. But in this weapon of ethics, because the ammunition was of the soul and one's own belief, it was never exhausted. And that is what defeated the racist whom they were opposing.
One other interesting thing about Gandhi is his time as a lawyer. And often in the US, we talk about the importance of the rule of law
Yes.
and the fact that our laws are supposed to protect everyone equally. And when they don't, then we have situations of inequality, of racism, of trouble in our community. And I wish you would say a little bit about how nonviolent protest leads to change in the law.
Well, if you see him as a lawyer, if you see Bapu as a lawyer, he became famous as the non-litigating lawyer. Unlike, the businessman lawyer who sees profitability in court appearances, Gandhi was the other way around. He wanted resolution for his clients. And so he became a non-litigating lawyer, and most of his cases were settled outside of the court because he became a counsel for his clients in a conciliatory manner between the fighting parties. And he brought about a rapprochement that was satisfactory to both. And so it was built on the basis of equality, not on the the law itself, the wordings of the law, but on the spirit of justice. There's a difference. You can practice a law by its definition, and then you can practice a law by its intent. There is a big difference between the two. The intention of law is justice, but the definition of law is for the cleverest to exploit to the best of their ability. And so those were the two differences, and that is what helped him also in practicing. Where even when he was triumphant in his battles against the British, he allowed them the ability to believe that they had not been defeated, that they were being magnanimous in acceding to the demands of the people. He did not allow them to feel for an instant that he was manipulating them to that level of understanding.
So we're
And that
always
is where,
looking for maintaining human dignity of all
yes, even in his
parties.
opponents, he was always very careful of not demeaning them, not depriving them of their dignity, and making them believe that although this man is fighting us, he does not intend to defeat us.
One of the things that we're facing today, I think in the world, in many countries, is that people are so divided and they see things in black and white. They see my side is good, that side is all bad. What do you think Gandhi would say to that?
I think there his very basic belief that every individual, every life, there was a good side of that life and a bad side of that life. And in every individual. And the side of that individual that was manifest at that particular instant was what made him or her behave that way. So he did not dismiss anybody as being absolute evil and did not also accept anybody to be permanently good and virtuous. He believed that there was a good part and a bad part in everybody, and he believed that it was his duty to always try to awaken the good part in everyone, within himself also and in others also. So his entire practice was to encourage the goodness within human beings, the goodness within life itself, rather than to challenge the dark side.
Part of the purpose of this series is to look at the interfaith side of peace building.
True.
And many of these ideas show up in one way or another in all of the major religions of the world. So, would you have a few words about the interfaith nature of peace building?
Well, I think Bapu believed in his lifetime that all the faiths in the world, although they identified their God as an individual different from everybody else, but the virtues that they attributed to their God, that God, were always the same. They were always common. It wasn't as if Christ had some special ability and Allah was different and our Bhagwan was different. We had different names, but everything else was one and the same. And for that, he believed that the core idea of every religion was peace. Because only if there was peace, then that religion could survive. Because what was religion? It was a group of humans practicing that. And if there was no peace, they wouldn't be able to coexist themselves, within themselves. And so he believed that the basic ideology of every religion was peace. And he stressed the point that it was the beholden duty of every individual to make a friendly study of the scriptures of every other religion. Even today, when we are very magnanimous, we talk about doing a critical study of the other scriptures. But we don't realize that the term itself negates our noble intentions, because when you do a critical study, you're trying to find faults with what is true for the other person. But when you do a friendly study, you're looking for the common ground. You're looking to come together rather than tear apart. And so he stressed the point that we must make a friendly study of all the other scriptures of religions in this world to understand the common ground of all the religions. And once we do that, then the nomenclature we use for our religion or for our God will be immaterial, because we will know the eternal truth and not the labels that we ourselves have put on that. So I think that is where he talked about the universality of faith, the importance of interfaith dialogue. He did not want interfaith arguments. He did not want interfaith debates. He wanted a dialogue. He wanted a free exchange of opinions with respect. While I may not agree with your opinion, but I respect your opinion. There is a big difference in that.
At the same time, I think our situation in the world now is that there are basic differences in the religions, in the nationalities, in the experiences, and we don't want to gloss over those too easily.
I
At,
believe,
at the
I
same
believe,
time,
I'm
there,
sorry.
there is a way to talk together, as you say, to try to understand where the other religion is coming from, what its tradition is, respectfully.
That would only happen if we understand. We must realize that we are always going to be different.
And that's not a
You
bad
know,
thing.
and it's not a bad thing. And everybody has a right to practice their own different self, as we have a right to be our own selves. And unless we understand that difference and we respect that difference, there will be no love established. Today we tell everybody that a relationship is all about compromise. But when the relationship is only about compromise, then you reach a limit and say, no, I'm not giving up anymore. But when a relationship is based on understanding and respect, then you don't have to compromise, because we will respect and understand the right of the other person in that relationship to be different than us. And that is what is required. But today, we are hell bent on finding the differences that split us apart and not finding the glue that keeps us together, bonded together.
There are always different national boundaries too. Could you say something about how peace building looks in different countries?
I don't believe in versions of peace building. It is differently practiced only because there are selfish interests that have come into it. And the greatest hurdle for peace building, and what makes it, as you say, different ways in different nations, is this whole concept of nationalism and patriotism. And so we confine ourselves to the narrow confines of the borders of our nation or the flag under which we stand, and exclude everybody else. But I think we need to come out of those narrow confines and start believing in the oneness of people, above race differences, above nationalities, above narrow parochialism, above economics also. Unless we start respecting life in its purest form. And over here, I don't only mean humans. I mean peace with all life forms. That was what Gandhi's practice and belief was, and ideology was. Peace with all life forms. Only if we go to that level, then can we truly claim to be practitioners of peace and non-violence. Otherwise, it's all just a convenient adaptation and not an ideal.
What would you say to someone who wants to reach out a hand to someone they consider different? How would you encourage that?
I would say try to push somebody up rather than pulling them up. Because when you start trying to pull people up, you're trying to impress on that person that I am, drawing you out of that pit. But when you push somebody out of that situation, you're saying, look, we're both in it together. And I'm going to push you out, hoping that you will then push me out too. So I think it is and the greatness and lasting ability of these leaders was their humility, never ever giving their followers the notion that they were mere followers and they had to be dumb. They did not need to use their intellect. They just had to be, you know, run when the master said fetch. That is true for military organizations, but not for life, the way to lead life. And I think that is where we must have the humility of never being patronizing in our doing good gestures.
Well, I think we're coming up on the end of our time together, our 30
Well,
minutes, and it flew
uh-huh.
by. I really appreciate all your insights, and I think we've received things to ponder in our own hearts.
Well, it was lovely being able to speak with all of you. And before I leave, I just like to narrate an instance. Because we started with the civil rights movements, I'd like to just finish with the anecdote of Dr. King that happened when he came to India in, I think it was either in 1959 or 60. I'm not exactly sure when it was, but he was invited by the government of India, and so he was taken around the country as a state guest. When he landed in Mumbai, the first thing he expressed was that I want to go to Gandhi's house. There is a house in which Gandhi used to live when he was transiting through Bombay, which is now a museum where all visiting dignitaries go. And it's come to be known as Gandhi's house. And Dr. King went there directly from the airport. And he went and took a look at the museum. And there is one particular room that has been kept the way it used to be when Gandhi stayed over there. And everything is untouched and it's glassed up and locked up. So people can see it from the outside, but you can't go in. So Dr. King requested the director of the museum if he could be allowed to go in and sit near the seat where Gandhi sat on a small mattress on the ground. And so they opened the door, and Dr. King went and sat over there. And he requested to be left alone because he wanted to meditate over there. And so everybody left him alone. And then the hours just flowed by, and it was soon closing time for the museum. So the director finally went up to Dr. King and whispered in his ears that the museum had to close, and so he would have to leave. And to her shock, Dr. King expressed his desire to live in Gandhi's house for the duration of his stay in Bombay. And it caused a flap because he was supposed to stay in one of the most luxurious hotels of Bombay. The arrangements were made, but he said, "No, I want to stay in Gandhi's house." So finally, they cleared a small room for him, and he went and stayed for 3 days. He stayed in that house, in that room. He would go for all his state functions, come back, sit next to Gandhi's seat and meditate, and stay in Gandhi's house. On the third day, when he left, he wrote in the visitors' book. He said, "I have been in communion with Gandhi, and I have felt his presence in that house. And I feel myself invigorated to go back and fight for the rights of my people. Gandhi has now charged me up to ensure that I get the equality for my people." This was the kind of effect Bapu had on people who understood it, not just merely worship it, but understood what that man had done and who that man had become. And that is where even today we see people who get so inspired by the ideal that is Gandhi, not the human who is Gandhi.
I really appreciate that story. It brings it to such a human level, and it brings it to something that we can aspire to when we read about peace builders, when we hear about peace builders. They all have a special view of life as sacred, life as love and peace, and we can tap into that.
Mhm.
So I want to thank you so much for all your insight.
Well, I want to thank you for this opportunity to come and share my thoughts with you and all the people, and for the wonderful dialogue that we managed to have in this brief period of time.
It is a short period of time, but I feel inspired, and I
Thank you.
thank you.